All right, everybody, we're going to be doing notes for chapter 10. We're starting, and we're doing this a little different. Obviously, I'm not doing it by recording in the classroom. I thought it best to kind of avoid, some of the social contact with the person who's been giving me the camera. So, not that that person has any problems, but still just trying to stay as isolated as possible going into this time period. So as we start this chapter, we're going to be doing something a little bit different for this day in history and famous birthdays. What I want you to do with the assignment you hand in for these notes is you look up something that happened on this day in history, which would be April 7th, when you'll be watching this, and a famous birthday from April 7th, and put them on your assignment. That is for credit. It's not extra credit. You need to do that. Find one thing that happened on April 7th that's important to history, and find one famous person born on April 7th. Just do one, don't do more. But be interesting just to see some of the things you find on there. So it's pretty easy. Just do a Google search and you'll find what you're looking for. Well, as we move on, we're going to be talking about what happens in Indian Territory right after the Civil War is over, some continued expansion, and some of the ways that the United States government and soldiers and settlers in general had to deal with Indians. Some of the Indian tribes are going to be peaceful, but there's going to be some pretty brutal Indian tribes during this time period as well. So we're going to begin starting there. So, Trouble on the Plains, chapter 10. Really, we're going to start by talking about two different things that the government did that really opened up westward expansion, even more than it already had been going. So these are pretty important factors. These congressional acts, the first being the Pacific Railway Act, helped open up the West. Part of the Pacific Railway Act is an attempt to create, obviously, the transcontinental railroad that we've talked about, and to continue to build railroads, but also importantly, the development of the telegraph along those railroad lines. The telegraph had already been pretty present in the East, but there still hadn't been a real connection of the communication all the way from the East to the West. So they began doing that as well, which enables communication to go much faster. Plus, people can now travel by rail to get from one point to another. It's still going to take a while. There's still going to be a lot of people coming in wagons, okay? But over time, more and more people will maybe be able to come along the railway instead of in those wagons. The second one, probably the even more important one, was the Homestead Act of 1862. This opened up 10% of the land in the United States, or about 270 million acres, to settlement out west. And here's what this said, and this is important because this would be a question you need to answer on your assignment. What did you have to do according to the Homestead Act of 1862 to truly own your land? Well, here's what you had to do. You had to be at least 21 years of age. You had to be the head of a household. If that's the case, then you could claim 160 acres of public land. But before the land could become yours, homesteaders would have to pay an $18 filing fee for paperwork, live on the land, build a home, make improvements for 5 years. And that would include farming on that 5 years. And then after 5 years, if you had established yourself, you had a home, you had established a farm, then you could keep that land. So it was like a 5-year process. Hopefully you listened well to that to answer that question. If not, it is in your book also. If not, you can rewind and listen to it again. After this, you continue to see more and more Indian tribes removed from their lands, not in as large a numbers, and these would be smaller tribes. I'm not even going to go through who those tribes are. But some of the other things that happen here is that because of the Civil War, earlier agreements with the United States government were no longer valid. So because the 5 tribes chose to fight for the Confederacy, even if it was just part of the tribe, it means that the tribe broke their deals with the U.S. government. So they then had to create new deals, new treaties with the government. We're going to go over those here in a second. But one thing that was said for all of Indian Territory is that all former slaves had to be free, that they could no longer own slaves because, part of the Civil War ending was the ending of slavery across the entire United States. And these former slaves were called freedmen or freedmen, if you're talking about multiple ones, freedman for one former slave who was free. So that's all important because that's one of the questions you need to answer. And now talking about those new treaties for each of these tribes, they were not particularly the same. What's going to happen here too is that the government's going to buy up some of the land in order to give it to other Indian tribes. They will pay these tribes with money for that. Of course, they are pushing for there to be a single unified government in Indian Territory, but the tribes weren't 100% on board with that. However, tribes across Indian Territory, what would be, modern day Oklahoma, did agree at least to come and do some intertribal councils to agree upon some things to get together. Now, the first tribe to sign a new treaty with the U.S. government was the Seminole tribe. They did this in 1866. They lost all their land, which was over 2 million acres, to the United States. When we say lost, they were paid for it. But they were paid 15 cents an acre. Then they bought 200 acres on the western edge of Creek land at 50 cents an acre. So they sold their land for 15 cents and bought land for 50 cents. The Choctaw and Chickasaw then signed a joint treaty ceding the leased lands to the government for $300,000. This is where you first get the suggestion of the name Oklahoma, which means red people, as we've looked into from a Choctaw chief. Peter Pitchelin and Alan Wright were among those representing the Choctaw, and Wright was the one who suggested Oklahoma be used for a name for this new territory. Now, it doesn't get the name right away, but eventually it does become known as Oklahoma Territory and eventually the state of Oklahoma. The tribe that really probably got the best deal was the Cherokee. They sent two groups to Washington. One was under Union supporter John Ross. The other was the Confederate group of Stan Wadey. The Cherokee had to give up their lands in Kansas, which was to be sold for at least $1.25 an acre. So remember, we had the Seminoles selling their land for 15 cents an acre, but this land in Kansas is being sold for $1.25 an acre. The government also had the right to relocate other tribes to the Cherokee outlet. The relocating tribes and the Cherokee would negotiate the cost of the land. So the Cherokee didn't lose any of their land in Indian Territory, but in Kansas they had to sell that land and agree that the government could remove some other tribes to the Cherokee outlet. So obviously Cherokee got a much better deal than the other tribes, partly because the land was in Kansas, which was becoming a new state at this point in time. Well, during the Civil War, the Plains Indians tribes were busy, meaning during the Civil War, United States military men who had been at like Fort Gibson and Fort Coffee and other forts in Indian Territory, they actually left those to go fight in the Civil War outside of Indian Territory. So, you have the Union and Confederacy. Union troops left early in the Civil War to go fight the war somewhere else. This did lead to Plains Indians tribes raiding settlers because there was no military presence to stop them from doing so. So they took advantage of this lack of military presence once the forts were abandoned. Some of the tribes that did this more often than others were the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the Comanche. They did this to Colorado troops. They were eventually driven out of Colorado. However, the Cheyenne tribe was what came to be known the Sand Creek Massacre. Several bands of Cheyenne and a few Arapaho, over 550 people, were camped at Sand Creek when they were attacked by Colorado regiments. Over 150 Indians, mostly women and children, were killed in the surprise attack. Some Cheyenne, including a band led by Chief Black Kettle, were later put onto reservations. Now, a reservation is a term maybe we're more familiar with today. The original Indian removal, they didn't use the term reservation. So like when the Cherokee, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole Creek came, they didn't call that a reservation. But here they're going to start using the term reservation for these Plains Indians to live on. And a reservation is simply an area set aside for use by particular people, and in this case, in Indian Territory. Now, we look at that massacre, Sand Creek Massacre, and we go, man, that's terrible. They killed women and children in this massacre, the soldiers from Colorado. The thing is, these tribes had been killing women and children, settlers. So I'm not saying it means you should kill women and children, but unfortunately, a part of what happened here was, you would see the death not just of soldiers from each group, but also of civilians. Now, I also want to point out later on, it won't be till the next lecture, but I'm going to talk specifically about the Comanche and how cruel they could be. So that will be important for us to understand when you understand the response that the soldiers oftentimes would have to some of the raids that these tribes would do. Well, embittered by the dealings with the military and white settlers, many Plains Indians continued to target wagon trains and freighters passing through, in this particular case with Fort Nichols, the panhandle part of Oklahoma, along the Cimarron route of the Santa Fe Trail. A noted trapper and soldier named Kit Carson, which is Christopher was his name, but he was a colonel. He established Camp Nichols in what is now the Oklahoma Panhandle. Now, that was accidentally. However, they were planning on putting this in New Mexico, but they accidentally put it further east than they realized, meaning it ended up being in what was Indian Territory or the Panhandle for what we know it as today. When they established this, they built what were called dugouts. I have a photo coming up on the next slide, so I'll show you what that is. But that's basically a home that is built half above ground and half below ground. Some advantages there: keep it cooler in the summer, a little bit warmer in the winter. Would be some of the benefits. Also, you don't have to have quite the same amount of goods to build it, because some of it you can use the ground and dig into that instead of having as much wood to build this. So it had some advantages to it. And really what Fort Nichols was there for was to provide safe passage along the Cimarron route for settlers, but also for people who were doing trade. So they would often escort people through this area. Interestingly, however, this Fort Nichols was abandoned in September of 1865, and it wasn't established much before that, so it didn't last very long in general. So the Medicine Lodge Treaty, like I said, I'll show you a dugout here in a minute. The Medicine Lodge Treaty was an effort to stop the attacks of the Plains Indians tribes and encourage them to adopt a farming lifestyle and basically a more white lifestyle. You can think of it like the civilization plan that the government tried to use with the 5 civilized tribes. They're now going to try to do that with the Plains Indians tribes. So many tribes do arrive in 1867. The Kiowa, Comanche, Kiowa, Apache, Cheyenne, and Arapaho agreed to meet at Medicine Lodge, which was in Kansas, along the Medicine River, which was believed to have healing powers. Here they negotiated for 3 weeks. There were lots of speeches that were given, talked about different terms for the treaty. The Plains tribes would basically have to live on a reservation, learn to farm rather than roam the prairies, learn the white man's way of life. As well, the Indians would be protected from white hunters and would receive food and clothing each year as long as they stayed on the reservation and followed those rules. The United States government would kind of take care of them. We'll get into some of the negative aspects of this concept here in a little while. The Kiowa and Comanche signed a joint treaty in October of 1867, agreeing to live on a reservation located in what is now southwestern Oklahoma. In a separate treaty, the Kiowa Apache agreed also to live on the Kiowa and Comanche reservations. Okay, so you do have them begin to agree to parts of this Medicine Lodge Treaty. Now, here's some pictures of dugouts. One is a modern day picture of a dugout and what they would look like. And then the past one, the black and white one, is actually a picture from way back in the day. Look at that hat, for one, kind of a goofy hat that guy has on. And that's quite the cowboy hat. I don't know if that'd be called a 10-gallon hat or what. But this just gives you kind of an example of what those would look like. Well, unfortunately, even with the Medicine Lodge Treaty, these tribes did not stay on their reservations and didn't cease attacking settlers. So you begin this campaign by a man named Philip Sheridan. He was a general, an important military leader. There had continued to be brutal attacks, like we said, in Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, areas like that. So Sheridan decides he's going to have to take the battle to the Indians to get them on board. to try to be more peaceful towards settlers. So he was a major general, um, and he chose to do this campaign in winter because he felt like the Indians would be quiet, a quiet time for the tribes, so they would not be expecting it. They wouldn't be out doing the raids themselves, so this would be the best time to do it. The Cheyenne, led by Chief Black Kettle, had set up a winter camp along the Washita River, a location that was actually not on the reservation. Now we're going to find out that Black Kettle, I don't think, intended to do this, although some other Indians did intend to get off the reservation. They camped a few miles from larger camps of other Cheyenne, Kiowa, and Apache. Black Kettle and an Arapaho chief, Big Mouth, traveled from their winter camp to Fort Cobb in November of 1868 to ask a general there for peace and protection. The general told them that he could not provide them protection because they were off their reservation where they were settled. The chiefs then returned to their camps. In the meantime, some young Cheyenne warriors had ignored the Medicine Lodge Treaty. They continued to roam off their ancestral lands. They were led by Cheyenne war chief Roman Nose. The band furiously attacked Kansas settlers, and wagon trains stopped that were crossing western Kansas. Sheridan directed Lieutenant Colonel George Custer. Yes, this is George Armstrong Custer, famed for Little Bighorn, one of the worst massacres of U.S. soldiers in American history. But here he is in Indian Territory fighting Indians. And George Custer was a colonel during the Civil War as well. Sheridan directed Custer to find and punish Indians who were responsible for the Kansas raids. Custer and 800 troops of the 7th Cavalry rode south. Following the trail of a small raiding party, one of the officers with Custer, who was named Captain Albert Barnuts, had mixed feelings about this particular goal and particular raid. And I actually really like this quote. This is something I think that is very significant. It says, "It is certainly foolish to fight Indians with one hand and to make presents and give them arms with the other." So this is the whole idea of the reservation being questioned. And it is true that you understand you want to keep settlers safe. But by putting them on reservations and trying to provide for their needs, you're kind of taking away their ability to take care of themselves. So you're encouraging them not to take care of themselves, which is unfortunately what there's still some reservations around today. A lot of Indians just kind of sit around relying on the government to take care of them, which is not a wise move. And then those Indians that didn't want to stay on the reservation here are still causing problems. So you're giving them things with one hand, and some of those things were weapons that they could fight against you with. Custer's troops marched through the snow to reach the Washita Valley to Black Kettle's Cheyenne camp after midnight on November 27th. They took positions and attacked 51 lodges there just before dawn. Custer, after the battle is over, is very loud. Custer reported about 100 men, women, and children had been killed. The Cheyenne claimed only 30 had lost their lives. Chief Black Kettle and his wife, Medicine Woman Later, were among those killed. That's her name, Medicine Woman Later. That's a weird name. More than 50 Cheyenne were captured. 21 of Custer's men were killed. Troops slaughtered hundreds of Indians' horses, mules, and other goods, and they burned the Indians' food, clothes, blankets, and lodges. Now, we'll get to that in a little bit because they're going to do this at the next battle as well, and we'll talk about why they would do something like that. The noise here was heard from Cheyenne and Arapaho villages nearby. Kiowa warriors also downriver heard what had happened, and they came to help Black Kettle. They encountered their Major Joel Elliott's detachment. Elliott was killed in the fighting. Custer quickly retreated to Camp Supply with the hostages, which is going to lead us to the next battle. Okay. These are both happening in 1868, and kind of one happens because of the other. So as a part of Sheridan's winter campaign, Lieutenant Colonel A.W. Evans led troops from New Mexico in 1868, November, across the snow prairies to the western base of the Wichita Mountains. The Comanche were camped in a valley near here. This has been a place where the Comanche had been able to hide for a long time because it was well easy to defend because of the mountains that were available there. And on Christmas Day, uh, Evans' troops attacked the Comanche camp that had 60 lodges. The Indians were outnumbered and outmanned. Artillery shells were fired from a small howitzer cannon and did a lot of damage. Um, Evans' men entered the Comanche camp, destroyed teepees, food, supplies, and even buckskin dolls, several tons of dried buffalo meat. The tribe's winter supply for food were destroyed and thrown into the nearby pond, which became known as Dried Beef Pond. There were many deaths at the Battle of Soldier Springs, as at the Battle of Washita. But the significant part and the plan here was to confine all Indians to their reservation. It included destroying food, shelter, horses that the Indians needed to survive so that they would be forced onto the reservation where the government would be able to provide for their basic needs. So that's why they destroyed all of those things, because they were, when I say encourage, they were forcefully encouraging them to get back on the reservation, and the government would provide their food, their horses, their shelter, and other supplies. But if they were off the reservation, those things would be destroyed. So it was definitely a way the government was trying to use this system to keep these Indians in line. Problem is, you're taking away these Indians' freedom to travel. Now, in a lot of cases, some of these Indians were violent, so it's a difficult situation to deal with. That's for sure. There certainly was no easy answer, but there are times when it seems like they could have maybe chose a different method to do some of these things. But there are some times when war with the tribes was necessary. And like I said, we'll talk about the Comanche later, next lecture, and you'll see the difference in just how big a deal it is that some of these tribes were extremely brutal to settlers. Okay, well, it is during this time period that you have the development of Fort Sill, which is near modern-day Lawton, and Fort Sill is still an active military base today. We were going to go there on an Oklahoma history trip, which unfortunately won't be happening, at least not when we had planned it. Don't know exactly what the plan will be for sure. So they needed a garrison here primarily to deal with the Comanche. This is in the heart of Comanche country, and the primary goal here was to keep the Comanche in check, especially across the Texas and Oklahoma border. Oftentimes the Comanche would be on their reservation, but they would go into Texas and raid settlers. So it was a pretty big deal. There was a effort to build the camp, and this camp was built by the 10th Cavalry, which was a group of buffalo soldiers. A buffalo soldier is simply a black soldier. Black soldiers built Fort Sill. This is what the Indians called them. That's why they got the nickname Buffalo Soldiers. In fact, in just a side note, if you know who Bob Marley is, he's a reggae artist. He has a song called Buffalo Soldiers, referencing black soldiers. Now, initially, this fort wasn't called Fort Sill. I'm not even going to share the original name, but it was named Fort Sill in 1869. Philip Sheridan is the one who renamed it. He named it after Joshua Sill, who was a friend and brigadier general who died during the Civil War. It soon grew to house over 500 troops and became an important part of trying to keep things peaceful in Indian Territory. Now, before I sign off, I have one more question I would like you to answer. That isn't going to be on your assignment. You're going to have to add it to it. It's a very simple one, and you can't get it wrong. What is your favorite color? I'm going to be asking one of these questions every lecture. Something just to tell me your favorite something. My favorite color is blue. I do like purple a lot too, not just because I go to school, not just because I teach at Wesleyan, but I've always liked purple. But blue is my favorite color. So, signing off for today, hoping that you guys are doing well, and I will see you later.